I'm just going to introduce the panellists really quickly. So from Radio New Zealand, we have Jeremy Rose. Take a seat. National Cycling Manager of the NZTA, Dougal List, down the front here. Co-founder of Frocks on Bikes. Sorry, Leo, I got that wrong earlier in the week. Leah Murphy. And chairing the discussion today is the chair of Cyclo Wellington, James Burgess.
I think one of the things that really struck me was the contrast between the different cities that we saw there, different cities around the world with really different conditions there. How would you compare Wellington to some of the cities that we saw in the movie? Maybe Dougal, what do you think?
Well, I like the contrast between the cities, and I've been lucky enough to been to and visited quite a few of the cities, and I think one of the big contrasts in Wellington is we're really at that tipping point of the growing transport problem in Wellington. We've actually had a relatively good run in terms of mobility and ease of getting around, relative to a type of mode that you choose. Whereas you talk to anyone who's been trying to get across town in the last kind of 6 months, and they're constantly noting that Wellington's kind of hitting a tipping point, and that is helping to change the conversation, I think, about how people choose to get around, and looking more and more at alternative options where they live and time they travel or how they travel as well. And as one of the people made the urban planning professor from Sao Paulo made the comment that congestion's the solution.
And maybe for a counterpoint, Leah, the taxi driver in Copenhagen. So I thought that was kind of an interesting viewpoint to take.
It was a very interesting viewpoint, and obviously quite the opposite to what we experience while we're cycling in the city, where we feel a bit like an illegal alien in our own towns and our own cities, squished between footpath for walkers and the road for cars. So that's I think one of the really more difficult and crucial things that we need to see changing is the culture around cyclists and cycling, or people who bike, and considering it's not necessarily people who think of themselves as cyclists. And some of the campaigns that Wellington City Council has done around getting aunties and mums and dads in a portrait campaign and plastering those around town has really helped with that type of attitude shift. I think for the next one, so the urban planning professor, I think it's Professor Raquel Rolnick, I think if I pronounce it correctly. So she wished her car would disappear overnight. Obviously that's not really a reality at the moment, but self-driving cars are seen by some people as a real solution to the transport problem. So maybe Jeremy, do you think this is a good idea? Do you think self-driving cars are the magic answer?
Oh, I think they sound magic, but I can't see how they answer anything. I mean, if you've got one person sitting in a self-driving car reading a book, I don't see how it solves any of the congestion problems at all. So to me, they seem a bit of a red herring at the moment. Self-driving buses, again, all they do is get rid of one job. I think if there is, the people that get excited by them see them as being, driving more logically, and possibly, there's these kind of technical fixes. But to me, no, they don't excite me at all.
Yeah, I'd actually chuck a bit of a different view in there. We're going to see a massive disruption, not only from self-driving cars, but all sorts of aspects of technology over the next 20 years, and it presents a massive opportunity. Some of the statistics presented, like the 70% of LA is given over to cars and parking. I suspect most of that's actually car parking. The driverless car and the disruption caused by different forms of car ownership, not just driverless cars, but how we own cars, how we choose to share car ownership, I think presents a massive opportunity, because the biggest barrier to implementing cycling that we face around the country is car parking. And if we can reduce the demand for car parking, particularly in our busy spaces, our busy, really more urban spaces. It presents a massive opportunity for reallocation of that space for other forms of mobility. So it's a tough one, I think. Where will it go? I don't know. It's one of those, 20 years ago we all thought, 30 years ago we all thought we'd be getting around in jet planes. We're not. But the disruption caused by technology, I think it's a huge opportunity if we harness it right.
How much of the problem is people just, part of the car, it's given people the idea that they should be able to park within metres of wherever they want to go. To me, that's part of the problem. So I lived in Barcelona, had a car, which we only used to get out of town. I often parked at 15 minutes walk away from where I lived. And that was just normal, and it meant that you just didn't use it. You only used it when you were leaving town. And I think part of the problem is we're so obsessed with this idea of getting incredibly close, which of course you can on a bicycle, and you can if you walk. But, I think maybe, and this is the problem. I don't want to be in a war situation between cyclists and motorists, but to me, people driving a car into town, I'm hoping that one day that'll be seen like lighting up a cigarette in a movie theatre. There's just no need for it most of the time if you've got okay public transport.
I think that's something I reflected on myself earlier this week. So we have a car at home. I don't tend to use it to get into work. I live a fairly short distance to work. I like to bike to work. No surprise there. But that particular day, earlier this week, I needed to carry a big package into the city with me to post it, and didn't fancy strapping it to the back of my bike. It was a bit fragile. I was a bit worried about it. So I took the bus into work, and I was quite lucky that I'm served by a really good bus service that goes very close to my house and close to my work. So I took the bus in, and there was an event on here, one of the earlier events in the series, after work. So I walked from work to here, it was kind of cool that Wellington's a compact city, so we've often got that sort of option available to us. And then when this finished, I kind of came out and I was ready to get on my bike. Remembered I didn't have it with me. didn't really fancy walking home. But coming back to the technology thing, I thought, actually, Uber. And I didn't have to go and find a taxi rank or there weren't probably enough people looking for a taxi right near where we were that there would have been a taxi waiting outside, but I could quite quickly call an Uber and it was fairly cheap to get home. And I think those alternatives maybe when you talk about technological disruption, so maybe people are travelling in a car but they're not owning the car, things like that. Leah, one for you. Do you think that we need to actually actively make driving more inconvenient to encourage people to start choosing those other things? So Jeremy mentioned it earlier. It's the idea of people using the car but not bringing it into the city centre. Do we need to start not solving the traffic jam or charging fees to enter cities or making parking expensive?
I think that's definitely part of the picture. Making parking more expensive or less convenient. The London congestion charge, is a solution in particularly large cities that can really free up the traffic congestion situation in a city. But you don't always want to look at the negatives. Some people do need to use a car on some occasions if they have young children or they have differing abilities, or sometimes that package some people might choose to use a car for that occasion when they would normally bus or bike. So certainly, we heard that building roads doesn't solve the solution, widening the roads either, which is actively trying to manage the traffic jam, but also using, positive means of encouraging other modes.
Yeah. And maybe Jeremy, back to you on that one. What sort of, if we think about measures that someone might take to encourage people to not take the car for some journeys, are there some that might be particularly effective upon you, if you like, or some that strike you?
I think there are. There's basically two main ones that we think of, and the more democratic one is creating traffic jams, and that if you make it all cost, then the rich just pay the things and the poor can't do it. So traffic jams are more democratic. On the other hand, I don't think anybody wants to see miles and miles of traffic jams. So I think there is a dilemma there. It's improving public transport. When my kids were at school, I was bad. I did drive them to school and had a bike on the back. One of my kids is disabled, it was part of it. But the main thing was there was just no footpath between my house and the school. And now there is a footpath. So, quite a simple and I live in Melrose, and it was along Hornsey. For a long time there was no footpath, and that stopped a lot of kids walking to school that could. So I think there are little things that can be done. And again, I'm not anti-car in the sense that I've got a car and I quite enjoy driving sometimes, but I do think that, you know, for me, the biggest worry I've got is I feel that I've been in the cycling demographic all my life. As a kid, most other people on the road seem to be other kids. As a teenager, as a person in my 20s and 30s, I've kind of gone up. And now I'm beginning to feel old, which is good, and I'm seeing a few younger people, but I'm still not seeing school kids. And so, you know, the Island Bay Cycleway for me is a kind of test, and I'm hoping that we're going to start seeing kids riding, and that's the big challenge. And I think if we've got kids riding, then, you know, that helps solve it going into the future. Because for some reason, lots of young people, I think you've probably seen the figures, they're not learning to drive. They don't seem to be cycling, but they're not driving as much, which I see as a positive.
I think going back to when we talked about congestion maybe having a democratic effect on people, one of the things we noticed in the movie that was the quote, I think, poor people own bikes and rich people own cars. Kind of open one to any of you. Do you think that this is something that reflects in New Zealand and in Wellington as well? And if it is it a barrier to more people getting on their bikes, the kind of the image of it, or do we see a different situation here?
I'd actually see a little bit of a different situation in a lot of New Zealand cities. In some parts of New Zealand, cycling is perceived as a very middle class thing. Look around our room tonight. Are we a broad spectrum of demographic New Zealand? Probably not. Car ownership is very, very cheap in New Zealand. We've made it cheap. We've got very cheap cars coming through from Japan. And that's led to a lot of the changes in terms of how kids get to school. It's led to a lot of the increased car ownership, the lower rates of people riding to work, and it's also led to massive changes in terms of how we plan and set out our cities. And a lot of the information that's coming through is that, you know, basically the less income you have, the further you are forced to kind of live from the centres of work and opportunity, meaning that we're kind of forcing people who have less means to live further away and therefore institutionalising their dependence on the car.
So I guess it kind of ties back into land use and accessibility to jobs and things like that. Okay.
And there, you know, it's certainly in terms of frocks on bikes and our people that have been attracted to frocks on bikes, you know, we're a group of people who, you know, who the car is less important, and you know, we're in a lucky, you know, live in a lucky situation where we can buy funky vintage clothes and ride a funky vintage bike, and that for us is more important than what car is sitting in your garage that gets maybe used on the weekends for a road trip somewhere. So it's quite a different situation. But yeah, I agree with Google about the people in low socioeconomic, you know, parts of Wellington or Auckland being more car dependent, you know, because of that situation that they're in. And you know, if you look at the statistics of who, you know, the greatest numbers of people who cycle in New Zealand or in the UK, you know, it is middle class white men. So, you know, and that's who have leisure time, who have recreation time, and you know, and I think that fits across, you know, men and women as well.
I've done stories on bikes in schools, but it was actually my colleague Simon Morton who did the one in Wellington, and he came back just excited because he'd gone out with these young kids. I've forgotten which school it was, but there were refugee mothers there also riding bicycles. So I think there is a real potential, but I don't think there's any denying that at the moment cycling is a kind of middle class activity. I am amazed, because I ride around past Oriental Bay, and I'm amazed at the number of people there who seem to drive to work. And you know, they're obviously wealthy rather than middle class, and I don't know where they're driving to. And they must all have car parks. And I thought the idea of living in Oriental Bay would be that you could walk to work, but it seems that quite a lot, I mean, it's probably not that many, but they're always pulling out in front of you on your bicycle. And I'm thinking, you know, where are they driving?
It's not universal though. So a bit of a story. Our board had a meeting in Gisborne last week where we're working with the Bikes in Schools Trust to put some money in, working with them to get bikes into lower socioeconomic schools. And one recent school, Kaiti School in Gisborne, had a delegation come along from the community, and they basically said, look, you know, why we see transport and bikes and public transport important in Gisborne is the schools are here, and the poorer part of town is here, if there's no buses and there's no access to bikes, because these kids can't afford bikes, so help us get bikes to them, these kids do not get to school. Period. That's just how it is. They can't get to school from one side of town to the other. So there are, it's not universal in New Zealand,
Yeah. No,
We had an interesting situation come up a couple of years ago where we had somebody from Hanoi email Frogs on Bikes to see if they could set up what we call a flock in Hanoi. And what an interesting scenario that would be, but she basically said that there is a huge cycling culture in Hanoi. I've been to Hanoi 10 or 12 years ago, and there is this amazing, wonderful cycling culture. And she said she would like to try and retain that and keep it being cool and keep it of interest where there is an increasing number of people buying cars, as that country develops, which was obviously reflected in the film in Sao Paulo and those, developing countries.
Beijing was the extraordinary thing for me. I hadn't been in Beijing since '89, and in those days, that was how you got around, and there would be 20 to 30 cyclists on either side of you. It was just the most delightful, exciting kind of riding you'd ever done. People would spot you and you'd race them, and it was unbelievable. It was a completely different city. So they've obviously, something I'm interested in there is that the e-bikes have really taken off. And it seems to me that in some places e-bikes are a positive for the environment. And I suppose they are in China now that you've seen what's happened, but they actually are a negative compared to what they used to have, which was, they still take up energy, which wouldn't be used otherwise. But yeah, do you see e-bikes as a big part of the future in getting people onto bikes in New Zealand?
We do. There's another part of the disruptive kind of technology going on out there. E-bikes and other e-wheeled vehicles, but e-bikes, particularly in cities like Wellington, which has hills and sometimes inclement weather, and Auckland, which can be pretty hot and sticky, and quite a lot of hills as well, actually, really does change not only the number of people that, biking becomes actually a feasible physical choice, but also the distance that people can ride as well. So you extend your normal assumed commute distance of about 7 kilometres. That easily doubles when people have access to an e-bike.
And wind is great. They're great for wind as well.
I've noticed people buy e-bikes either because they want or need the assistance, or because they like the choice of, actually that's the bike I take on the day I don't want to bike. It gets me past the not wanting to bike that day. That's right. And it still works.
Yeah. I think, it's the idea that a car is a status symbol, certainly in the Western world. The 60s, they talked about how many cities got built, for cars during that time. You go to Brasilia, which was built in the 60s, and that is, it's all about the car. And we've moved, my father's generation, it was all about the car. He rides a bike sometimes too, but that's an important thing for him. And then, in our generation, it's beginning to fall away, and we've got these subgroups of people in this room, no doubt, where that feature is less so, and then the millennials that are coming through. And there's research done by NZTA quite recently about, in New Zealand, they're choosing to own cars less and to use cars less. So, that sets us up for a really wonderful opportunity in New Zealand right now, and in Wellington with this, window of central government and local government spend on cycling and infrastructure. And statistics floating around about how 76% of Wellingtonians would ride a bike if they, had safer streets and standalone infrastructure. So, it's right before us. I don't know what, it's interesting to ask the question, why is it still so difficult? Why are there still real challenges? And it might be that we're at a tipping point and we haven't seen the full benefits yet. We've just got a little piece in Island Bay, and it's not a whole route. So that's the resistance to change, is a big part of it. And it would be nice to see broader society feel more comfortable with change that doesn't directly benefit them. But also, a greater understanding of people who aren't cyclists who choose to take a bike, and putting bike parks out in front of, employers who put in bicycle parking should be, thanked. But sometimes it's down in the garage and in a big shed, and it's quite industrial feeling, and it's not convenient,
So it needs to be kind of visible and up front,
out on the street, Yeah.
Maybe that's a part of it. And another story on that change and the kind of the disruptive change and pace of change I heard earlier this week was someone who grew up in a city in China, outside, maybe about an hour away from Shanghai, I think he was saying, and where they used to have the large numbers of people cycling in the same way as people have heard of Beijing and so on. But actually in that city, the pace of change was so fast that they went from having a lot of people cycling around to everyone buying cars, to a greater awareness of smog, environmental problems, congestion problems, and the idea that it's a good idea to support and promote cycling before they had time to rip the bike lanes out. So they actually got the bike lanes that were there before, and now becoming the core of their new bike promotion network. So that's pretty cool, I think. We've probably got time for one or two questions from the audience, perhaps, if there are any burning ones. Wave of hand and you'll get the microphone, maybe.
My name's Russell Tregoning. I ride a bike for health reasons as much as anything else. We haven't heard anybody speaking about health. The problem with these cars that are going to drive themselves means that people aren't going to get out and walk and bike the way they should if they're thinking of their health. What do the panel think about the health aspects and how important that is?
So in a lot of countries, they invest in cycling on getting more people on bikes to directly achieve health benefits. We're not doing that currently. We're chasing transport benefits, which indirectly lead to significant health benefits. So it's a kind of a paradigm shift and part, I think really in New Zealand we're at the start of a big journey. We've kicked off a massive investment program we've never had before in New Zealand's history ever to get more people on bikes. And I think how we build the coalition around that journey is a really important part of the next 2 or 3 years. We're starting with a focus around transport and getting our cities and places moving, but how do we broaden that and broaden the conversation to kind of talk about, how do we also get these health benefits and other societal outcomes that we all want as well.
I was on the board of the Newtown Union Health Clinic, and one of my proposals while I was there, ironically I gave up my position on the board because I needed to spend a lot longer in hospital than I would have liked, so cycling doesn't solve all health problems. But one of my proposals was to set up groups within I felt that the Union Health Centre should represent its members in all aspects of health. And one of my first proposals was to set up a cycling group within the Union Health Centre to promote cycling, to work with the schools and everything else. And I'm like you, I see it as a vitally important part of keeping people fit and healthy, in the same way that walking is, obviously. But as someone who's I think it's incredibly good for your mental health. There was a psychiatrist, and I've tried to find him. He was written up while I was living in Barcelona, he was written up in a local magazine, and he claimed that cycling was the best antidepressant known to man. And I've searched in both English and Spanish 1,000 times on Google and can't find it, because I've always thought it would be a great interview. But so apparently it is. It's a very good antidepressant.
Fantastic. I've read a recent report, I think it's the World Health Organization, put out a big report about diabetes and of course obesity and an obesogenic lifestyle is a big problem. And one of the main things in their report on diabetes was what should we do globally is actually build bike lanes, because that was one of the things that had that great potential to increase amounts of daily activity. So, interesting. Okay.
Yeah, I'd agree that cycling is one of those things that people have different motivations for doing it. For some people it's really fun. For other people it's, it is the health benefits, and for other people it's a climate sort of, reason or environmental reason. And so whatever those motivations are, it's I've always found it great that there are a whole set of benefits that come with it. And that's something we've always, at Frox on Bikes, have tried to promote, that it's, we don't want to try and appeal just to greenies or appeal just to hipsters or just to people who are into biking, try and make it more holistic than that. And if cities can make it, really fun and easy, or just make a wider range of transport choices available to people, then those benefits should come, and health benefits can be quantified and are in many studies that I'm sure people will be well aware of.
Excellent. Hugh, there was, yeah.
My name is Josh Coonan. I'd be interested if the panel has any one idea, if you could change the rules or increase pricing or do one simple thing that would make a huge difference very quickly to how we can cycle more.
Oh, those silver bullet questions are very tough.
My first thing in Wellington would be just to adopt the 30-kilometre speed limit in the central city throughout. Yeah.
It's got to be separated cycleways from our perspective, taking the fear factor away.
Yeah. 4-year political cycles.
That's a pretty good. I've been left with only one obvious one to say, so I'm going to have to say it, and not because I have a particular feeling one way or the others, but certainly something that affects participation is having a mandatory helmet law, and there are people who are put off cycling by that, and it becomes a question of personal safety and health versus public health in the larger scale. But there's a huge debate that we definitely won't go into in further detail.
Hi, I'm Alex Dyer. Trust it's on. I was really interested with the amount of they went into the lobbying with the motoring industry in the film, and so in the face of that kind of competition for people's cultural acceptance, I'm just wondering at what point will driving gasoline powered cars at the very least really be the next smoking that it is?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think as the kind of industry insider and sitting in the car park observed, the car industry is always going to be around because they're just so smart. They'll keep on evolving and changing and positioning themselves to be that kind of whatever car that you want it to be, because they will recreate their image in what the market desires. And they can do that because they're incredibly well-resourced, they're very, very smart, and they have huge interests to keep going. So I don't think that they'll ever actually be that way.
We've got a bit of a controlled study going on at the moment, I think, with the over 65s and the gold card. And, so we're providing a certain group, the urban retired community, can now travel for free a lot of the time. And I think that's had some really positive results, but it certainly hasn't, so they really have an incentive not to use their cars. And a lot of them, my dad's one of them, he gave up his car, but in general, it's kind of, it shows that even with that level of incentive, there's still a pretty strong attachment to that ability to go from A to B, door to door. So I'm not that positive. But I agree, I think there needs to, I think it's making the paths to alternatives incredibly attractive, and that's the way we're going to slowly get there. There is something about sitting in a metal box that seems to appeal,
The freedom of going from your door to your destination. Yeah. But it might also be, some of those disruptive technologies and different, car ownership approaches where it's, car shares that are either, publicly available, as in they're in an urban town, or there's something that a group of people own, one vehicle together, and maybe it's a self-driving car or an electric car, or who knows. But, some of that, those bigger shifts in how we think about cars in our lives might mean you could have less of them, but still have some of those advantages on occasion when you need it.
I think in terms of those disruptive changes or the ways people might change how they use cars, I used to live in Belgium, and they had a program where if you sold your car and you didn't buy a new one, in return for effectively handing in your rego plates, which was how it worked when you sold it, you could get a year's free public transport pass or a year's free car sharing scheme membership. And I think some of the policy things like those, where there is really a noticeable benefit to a city or to a region for that person getting rid of their car and starting to use the other method of transport, I think there can be interesting ones.
I'd also like to throw in a comment when you're asking a question about what's a silver bullet that might make a big step change. In cities where there's a large mode share, around 50%, the Copenhagens and cities in Norway of this world, there's half or more than half of those cyclists are women. And in New Zealand and US cities, UK cities, that's rather untapped, where we sit in Wellington at 3.4% mode share for cyclists. you know, there's 2-to-1 men to women taking on that challenge of being brave and riding on the roads. You know, and as we make it safer for people to cycle, you know, you're going to expand just suddenly, you know, the other half of the population. And there are many, I'm sure there are some male cyclists who also would feel more comfortable in separated cycleways, or just without feeling afraid to be on the roads.
So effectively democratising it so you don't need to enjoy the challenge.
That's right, yeah. Yeah.
Right, I think we've got time for one more. Sorry, sir, we just had one.
I think it's interesting we talk about Copenhagen and how wonderful it is and how many people cycling there, but a car in Copenhagen probably costs about 5 times what it costs in New Zealand. So there's been, for many years now, a real concerted effort to tax car ownership so that people, you know, it's too expensive for a lot of people to do cars. So what I guess we're looking at there is there was a real impetus to have culture change in this sort of car cycling thing. I'm just wondering from panel members, what is, if they were able to do one thing to attack or to create this culture change in New Zealand, in Wellington, to become a sustainable city or whatever, what would it be? What would they go for?
Well, I think in terms of that car usage, San Francisco, in order to address not only car usage but also bike share and public transport share, really focused on parking policy. And I think that's where, you know, cities like Wellington, like Auckland, can make a significant change very, very quickly. But you've got to be ready when you make that change. Otherwise, you know, if you put up the price of parking, people just get used to the higher price if they don't make the shift at the same time. So jumping back a few years in New Zealand, we had a massive opportunity to affect mode share and shift when fuel prices went through the roof. And a lot of people left their cars at home, got on public transport, and unfortunately Wellington's situation found it was a bit shit. And so they didn't sustain that mode. And then the prices of fuel went down and they moved back to their cars. So it's a kind of, you know, hitting those tipping points but being ready when they happen. So change your parking policy, but you've got to be ready to seize the opportunity at the same time.
I'd probably introduce free transport for all kids and students and the unemployed. You know, it would be, if I could do one thing straight away, because I think that would discourage that, or, I mean, it would encourage that promising trend of a lot of young people not getting their licences. So I think it's an anomaly at the moment to have, you know, all old people going for free and it's kids not. I can't see why we don't make it free for them.
If I could imagine a technological one, it would be some way of making the car usage more expensive where there is an easy alternative already in place. Because we know that nationally in New Zealand there are an awful lot of people who don't have alternatives because of land use or lack of services. So you don't want to penalise those people in order to try to solve a city problem. But if there was some gadget that would kind of gauge how much of a choice you were making when you took your car, maybe something like that.
And it's road tolls, you know.
All right. Is this on? Sorry, Ron. You can email everyone. Personally, I'd just like to thank all our panellists. Thank you very much for giving up their time to come and speak to us tonight. So big thanks from me and I think from everyone here for your insights on the issues tonight. And thanks for all you guys for coming. I hope you really enjoyed the film. Bigger and better next year, hopefully. David's over there telling how great it was. They can throw some more money into it next year. So yeah, thanks for coming and get right home safe.